welcome our first speaker of the series and of the night, Dr. Bob Turner. Dr. Bob Turner is a longtime resident of Bowen Island and Bowen Island's former mayor. He is a retired federal geoscientist and author of several books on the geology of Vancouver and the sea to sky region. He's also a filmmaker with over 45 short movies about wildlife and wild places around the Salish Sea on his Bob Turner YouTube channel and website, rsalishsea.ca. He was part of the team that achieved the UNESCO Biosphere Region designation for Howe Sound in 2021 and currently leads the Bowen Island Conservancy's biodiversity conservation initiatives. I will hand it over to Bob.
Thank you, Emma, for your kind introduction. What I wanted to do tonight is talk about the landscapes of the Salish Sea and how they came to be. And the story really is a story of moving tectonic plates, of moving ice age glaciers, and of moving rivers. And together, they have created much of what we see around us. I'm a geologist, and I got hooked by collecting minerals. I had a neighbor who lived a couple houses down who was a geologist. I didn't know that. He essentially put his rock collection into a sand pit in his backyard and invited all the local kids over. And anyways, I ended up with a rock and mineral collection that was vastly better than my stamp or insect or coin collection. And that sort of set the pace. Early on, I fell in love. I'm an Ontario guy originally, but fell in love with the West Coast early on. Ended up doing my graduate work at Stanford University in California. That was how I got to the coast. And then my wife and I moved up to Bowen Island, just outside of Vancouver in 1989, and we've lived there ever since. And I worked from there with the Geological Survey of Canada, and I was hired as a research scientist, but my great love was geological education, and I worked with some wonderful people. Some of the things we did is sort of on the table sitting there. A favorite was Vancouver City on the Edge, which I worked on with John Clegg, and we back in about 2003 or so. And that really got us into the mode of storytelling, the great stories of geology that Vancouver has. It's really, I mean, there's better geological storytelling here than anywhere else I can think of on the planet. It's just, everything's happening. So that's fun. So I retired from the Geological Survey of Canada back in 2014. I got into movie making, and I thought I would make geology movies, never did. Instead, I've made about 50 movies about salmon and herring and eagles and whales. And recently, I've sort of expanded out into the Salish Sea. Anyways, I am just now getting back into geology after sort of 10 years away from the subject. And tonight's a fun talk for me because it really is sort of my re-entry back into sort of geological storytelling. Anyways, all my movies are on my Bob Turner YouTube channel. And I also have a website, www.oursalishsea.ca. Boy, I'm having trouble with my advance. Okay, that works. Good. As long as something works. Salish Sea. So this is the geography I want to talk about. All the regions surrounding the Salish Sea, from Campbell River to Olympia, and from the eastern Fraser Valley out to the western edge of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Now, really, my interest surrounds the question why. Like, why do we have whatever those landscapes are that surround the Salish Sea? I've always been curious about that, always keen to sort of dig on the explanations. And so that's what we're going to do tonight, really focus on the whys that stand behind the landscape. And the first thing I'd like to move to really is the feature that I'd say is the defining landscape feature for the Salish Sea, and that is mountains. Mountains we might take as just a given, but in fact, Most of Atlantic Canada doesn't have mountains. Most of the eastern seaboard of the U.S. doesn't have mountains, nor the Gulf of Mexico, nor the Great Lakes, nor Hudson Bay. Those are all coastal areas that are quite flat plains. So why do we have them? The answer really lies in the nature of our planet and where we are on it. We are a hot cored planet. That means, at the highest temperatures are at the core, and that core gives off heat, and it creates a series, whoops, creates a series of mantle convections that rise from the core, carrying heat and moving up to the surface and then spreading laterally. And in doing so, in that spreading laterally, those currents drag the brittle crustal plates that create the surface of our planet. And the North American planet is moving westward because the mantle currents are rising under the Atlantic Ocean, forcing it to spread apart and pushing North America westwards. And we, the Salish Sea, sit at the leading edge of that North American plate, and that has created our mountains. And let me just dig into that. Here we're zooming in a little closer, right on our region. And this is a sort of an imaginary cutaway of the subterranean Earth below us. And it illustrates the continental plate, North American plate, driving westwards, driving over top of the oceanic plate that lies underneath the Pacific Ocean. And in doing so, it creates much of the fundamental geography that we live with. First of all, the material on the oceanic plate gets scraped off. Part of it, sediment and volcanic rock, it gets stuffed underneath the edge of the continental plate, and that jacks it up. And that creates both the Olympic Mountains and the Vancouver Island Mountains. A second process that is part and parcel of this thing that geologists call a subduction zone is thermal expansion. And you'll notice that artistically drawn here, as the oceanic plate sort of slides underneath the continent, of course, it's going to greater temperatures and pressures, and that creates mineral transformations that release water, and that water catalyzes melting. And melted rock is lighter than solid rock, and inherently it starts to rise, and it'll work its way however it can up any passageway available. And that upward movement of melted rock brings with it heat, and that heat warms the continental plate, and it creates an uplift because that's the only way that the continental plate can expand. It's constrained on all other sides, but it's open at the surface, and so it rises. And that creates the uplift that drives our mountain building. But that's sort of step one. Getting the uplift in process is sort of the fundamental starter, but how does that create mountains? And it does so by unleashing erosion. And that erosion is essentially accomplished in the valleys. Now, and I'm guilty of this too. I walk into the mountains. We all walk into the mountains. The first thing we do is we look at the peaks. The peaks are grand. The peaks are rugged, and they seem to be the dynamic part of the landscape. But in fact, it's the lowly valleys where all the action is really happening, because without a valley, there would be no mountain. It is the valley that creates the relief that separates mountain peak from sort of river bottom. And so the forces of erosion are focused in the valleys, whether by rivers or by glaciers or by landslides. Now, this is an illustration I'm just going to work through quickly that tries to simplify this and put it into a package. So that imagine when we're at the top of the screen here, before this sort of collision zone, the subduction zone starts, and the continental margin, or the coastal area is a lowland. And then collision starts, uplift begins and a plateau develops. And that unleashes the first of sort of the big erosive agents. And that might be rivers, it might be glaciers, depending on sort of the climatic situation. With time, river valleys will be carved, as we're here in this sort of third circumstance. And some mountain ranges are at this stage today. The Andes are a great example where remnant parts of the plateau that was uplifted are still there between the river valleys. The Altiplano is a famous example of an elevated plateau bound by mountains. However, we here in the Salish Sea region and all the way through British Columbia have had an ice age glaciation, and I'll get to this a little bit later. But that ice age glaciation really deeply eroded the mountains, and there is really very little of the remnant plateau left. But you can see that the tops of peaks really are limited by the height of the original plateau from which they were carved. And if you go to the top of Whistler Mountain, for example, Whistler or Blackcomb, and you look out over the landscape, there is, in spite of the fact that mountainscapes are very irregular, valleys and mountains, etc., in detail, when you look out at the horizon, the actual tops of the peaks are surprisingly uniform in character, and that reflects the plateau from which these mountains were carved. An interesting thing to do, anyone who's skied at Whistler might have already done this, is to take the peak-to-peak gondola, which runs from Whistler Mountain across the valley of Fitzsimmons Creek to Blackcomb Mountain. The resort is really built around those two mountain peaks with the village down here. And the peak-to-peak connects the two mountains. And it's a fascinating gondola ride because you hang in space for a long time way up above this valley. And it allows you, if you're so inclined, to contemplate the valley and not just the mountains. And the reason that's worth doing is that valleys represent missing rock. And you start to get your head around just how much rock is missing in mountain landscapes that we don't really think about. And it begs the question, where did all the rock go? And I'll come back to that question a little later in the talk. But let's hang on to that thought. So let's move on to arguably our most iconic mountains. And those would be, I bet we would all agree, are volcanoes. And this is Mount Baker viewed from about Saturna Island. And volcanoes are charismatic, one, because they're white. I mean, in the middle of the summer, there's not much white that's out there in the landscape, and it's usually just on the volcanoes. And the reason for that is they're the tallest peaks. They stand highest into the prevailing winds. They capture the moisture that leads to gigantic snowfalls. Mount Baker holds the record, I believe, for the largest single snowfall ever recorded on planet Earth. And so that feeds the formation of glaciers, and they hold their glaciers through the summer, and that is what sort of stands above us, this big white mountain. As well, they're solitary mountains, which is very unmountain-like. And I'll come back to that in a second, but the combination of their great height, their whiteness, and their solitary character really makes them commanding mountains. And Enchikai, Mount Garibaldi, Tahoma, Mount Rainier, Como Kultgen, Mount Baker sort of are the three big volcanoes that are visible from various parts of the Salish Sea. There are more Cascade volcanoes that hide back in the backcountry, like Glacier Peak up the Skagit Valley and Mount Meager up the Harrison River. But those we don't see and we don't typically associate with the Salish Sea. What makes a volcano unique, and of course, this almost goes without saying, is that they are self-built mountains. They construct themselves. Unlike almost all other mountains that are carved from some rising block of land, volcanoes build themselves. And you might think of them as literally a lava spring, in that they have to sit above a conduit that is very long lasting through geologic time, that allows the passage of magma up through the crust from deep below up to the crust to erupt either as lavas or as ash clouds that collectively over time construct the volcano. They are, just like other mountains, very prone to erosion. In fact, they are more prone to erosion because they are so poorly built. Unlike other mountains that have been carved from rock that was once deeply buried, essentially pressure treated. It's hard rock, it resists erosion. Volcanoes are built on surface, they've never been pressure treated, they fall apart fast. As a consequence, they are our most dangerous mountains. Forget about them erupting. Their instability is a more frequent problem, and sort of the Portland and Seattle areas sit in sort of hazard areas from potential mud flows that form by landslides on the mountain slope, mixed with snow and ice, turn into a slurry and can flow vast distances, flow all the way to the Salish Sea shoreline. So that's a well understood sort of hazard of our local volcanoes. Anyways, each of these volcanoes sits above this sort of what I call magma factory, or I call sort of a magma factory, deep down just above the oceanic plate. And any magma that can make it all the way to the surface erupts to contribute to a volcano. And magma that only makes it partway cools and crystallizes into rock becomes some form of granitic rock. But the two are very, very associated. And I sometimes think of granitic rocks as failed volcanic rocks. They just didn't quite make it to the surface. And so the next time you look at a Mount Baker or a Mount Rainier, think of it as just the very top end of a deep magma plumbing system that extends 60 to 100 kilometers deep into the earth. So I've talked about tectonics and mountain building, and in a sense, that's the big foundation framework for our area. The Ice Age is a sort of an essential and the dominant shaper of that landscape. And when I talk about the Ice Age, Earth history has had a number of ice ages. I'm referring to just the most recent one that ran from about 2.7 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago, which in geologic time is just yesterday. And geologists call this the Pleistocene era, or the Pleistocene glaciation. And at that time, at the peak, not throughout the whole period, but at times, because the ice during that period of time would expand and then melt back, expand and melt back. But at its peak, the ice covered most of northern North America, Greenland, and northern Europe. And this is sort of an artistic rendering of what those ice sheets might have looked like. I think it requires a great act of imagination to imagine what it would be like to be at the bottom of that glacier. I mean, if we all just sort of thought about the landscapes around us that we know and love, our garden, our streetscape, our townscape, and imagine that in the pitch dark below 1.5 kilometers of slowly grinding ice, capable of obliterating everything. That's a sort of an astonishing thought, to think that only 15, 16, 17,000 years ago, that was this place. And everything that we know today in terms of life forms have sort of re-pioneered the landscape since that time. We would probably, our coast would have looked much like what Greenland looks like today. And this photograph, taken from a plane looking into the interior of Greenland, you can imagine this great ice sheet being what the interior of British Columbia looked like. And it was a great ice sheet that was essentially stacked up against and prevented from flowing to the ocean in some places by this wall of coastal mountains. But ice streams sort of flowed down old river valleys and made their way to the ocean. And so this view is sort of reminiscent of important parts of the Ice Age that we would have, or the Salish Sea would have experienced. Now, the evidence of the Ice Age is just about everywhere, but I just like to go through a couple of things at different scales to sort of draw your attention to you. The first is, and I'm just going to use some specific examples. This one is a really lovely one, a favorite of mine. It's pretty close to home. It's on Highway 99, which is the highway that runs from Vancouver to Whistler. And it's just south of Squamish, BC, right at the base of Squamish Chief, which is this giant wall of granite, much loved by rock climbers. And you can see that the highway has blasted its way through some rock. And the surface of that rock is literally glints in the sunlight. It is so polished and formed, shaped into whaleback shapes. And if you get your nose up onto that rock, as these folks are, it just is a series of very molded, polished surfaces. And if you put your nose right where that guy's nose is, what you see is literally a polished rock that is scribed by parallel scratches. And those parallel scratches literally are the tracks of Ice Age glaciers. Now, to be clear, ice can't carve rock, but 1.5 kilometers of ice with pebbles and grit and sand embedded in the base of that ice sure can, and it does. And that base of great glacier flow is recorded and preserved in the rock. And if you go 700 meters up Squamish Chief to the very top, you might be surprised to still see that same polished rock with fine striae on it, pointing in the direction that the glaciers flowed down Howe Sound, and that's Howe Sound in the background. Two other places that really have quite magnificent glacial grooves and striae is Beacon Hill Park in Victoria at Finlayson Point. Really magnificent ones, and we're looking here out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And the top of Mount Grant on San Juan Island. Again, basically a molded, polished surface with fine striae pointing in the direction that the glaciers traveled. So we've had our nose sort of down on the rock here. Let's stand back and take a look at the rocks at a landscape scale. And one of the things you'll notice if you are in the vicinity of high peaks around the Salish Sea is that the very high peaks are craggy, but the lower hills and lower mountains are rounded. Now, why is that? Well, what you're seeing literally scribed out in the mountains is the height of the flowing Ice Age glaciers. Only the highest peaks stood above the ice, and those are the ones that retain their craggy shape. Everything else was molded. And the lower elevation the surface was, the more it was smoothed and rounded, because the thicker, that meant the ice was thicker, overriding that and had more weight to sort of do the grinding. Higher elevation hills, less rounded. And that pattern plays out in many places, that craggy to rounded. landscape. For example, if you go to the north end of Salish Sea up to Desolation Sound, you see those jagged peaks up high, whereas down below, a much more rounded landscape. And this is looking from close to the north end of or the west end of the Hood Canal Bridge. We're looking into the Olympic Mountains, and again, high craggy peaks. And it's a little bit hazy here, but you can see sort of the lower peaks, much gentler and rounded. And again, rounded by the flowing ice. So let's return to that question posed earlier in the talk. Where did all the rock go that was eroded by the glaciers? And the answer is that much of it, not all of it, but much of it underlies the lowlands of the Salish Sea and the Salish Sea itself. Some of it was literally exported out into deep water off the continental shelf to form a gigantic submarine fan. But let's take a look at what we can look at most easily, which is the lowland sediments. And Puget Sound is a fantastic example of this because a huge amount of that ground up mountain is stored as ice age sediments under Puget Sound. And so we're looking here, this is a view across Puget Sound. This is the Bremerton area here, and we're looking across the Puget Sound lowlands, very flat, low relief landscape, right up to the Olympic Mountains that form the western wall of the Puget lowlands. And this would be the Hood Canal, would be that water body in the far distance. So this is a big piece of geography. Or a big deposit of ice age sediments, about 150 kilometers north-south, 90 kilometers east-west, and on average 400 meters thick of sediments, in places as much as 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet of sediment under the Puget lowlands. And these sediments are largely hidden. We don't pay a lot of attention to them because they're obscured by forests, farms. They're great soils. They make great soils, and towns and cities. And really, our best opportunity to see them are where they are actively eroding as sea cliffs. And that's where these ice age sediments have been sort of examined scientifically and really show themselves well. This is a view just south from the ferry heading to Port Townsend. And then this is just as coming into Port Townsend, Washington. At the ferry terminal, you can see a thick layer of ice age sediments in behind the shore with the whole town built on top of it. And if you were to put your nose on that cliff wall, what you'd see would be a mix of pebbles, sand, and clay, all mixed together. And this is what geologists call a moraine or a till, which is really just means a mixture of stone and clay. Anyways, this is a classic geological or a ice age sediment, glacier sediment. These ice age sediments are beach makers because the active erosion of these cliffs basically form beaches at their base. The fines, the fine muds are all winnowed out and washed offshore, and what's left are the gravels and some of the sands. And Puget Sound has the best beaches or the most extensive beaches in the Salish Sea because it has the most extensive shorelines of ice age sediments. It's that simple. And it's much loved for that. And here's a map, just a quick look at the map, and you can see that the Puget Sound area is the yellow outlines the sediment, these ice age sediment areas. It's a huge area around Puget Sound. There's also extensive sediments like this from Victoria up the Saanich Peninsula, all the way along the eastern Vancouver Island. And then over on the Sunshine Coast, well, some of the little islands like Savory is an all sand island. It's one of these deposits. Also around the Powell River and Seashelt area of the Sunshine Coast, as well as the Fraser Valley. All of those areas are underlain by thick, thick deposits of these Ice Age sediments. So, when you see those, think of those big mountain valleys that are missing so much rock, and imagine that, much of that has just been ground, pulverized, and then laid to rest in the valleys all around the Salish Sea. So let's move to the very largest feature that the Ice Age essentially created for us. So we started with our sort of hands and knees on the rock, looking at fine scale stuff, and then we stood back and looked at whole mountain ranges. Now we're looking at the scale of the Salish Sea itself. And the most remarkable thing about about the west coast of the Northwest is the juxtaposition of two completely different coastlines. One, incredibly convoluted, with all sorts of deep inlets and islands. We call it a fjordland coast. And that extends all the way south to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. South of that is this astonishingly different, very simple, what I might call an even coast, just for lack of a better name. And of course, mariners know very well that sort of the whole coast from Alaska through BC is the Inside Passage. It's got all sorts of protected waters on the lee side of islands. Whereas once you round Cape Flattery and head south, you're in open ocean most of the way with very few anchorages. It's just a completely different world. What then can explain this remarkable juxtaposition? Well, it is the Ice Age and the Ice Age glaciers. And really what you're looking at is just the extent of glaciated terrain that exists all the way along the BC coast down into Puget Sound, and then sort of dances just south of the Canadian-US border. And the area that has the even coast is all the area that wasn't glaciated, which, if you think about it, okay, what if we didn't have an ice age? What would our coast have looked like? Well, it should look something like the coast of Washington, Oregon, a very simple coast, very unlike the fjordland coast. And let's just play out that game by actually looking at what, and this is speculative, but geologic evidence all points in this direction, that prior to the Ice Age, here we're over in present time, this is the Ice Age with the glaciers flowing out to the ocean and down into Puget Sound. This is likely the type of geography that existed prior to the Ice Age, where Vancouver and Seattle would have sat in a position in an interior valley, very much like Portland does today, or Redding, California. And it was only the Ice Age scour that essentially carved out these valley systems and converted them into the inland sea that we know today, which is a big thought. It's a big thought for me to sort of, and here we're sort of in Nanaimo looking northeast across the Strait of Georgia to what is Bowen Island there and the high peaks of the Coast Range. To imagine that all of that ocean, that Strait of Georgia, as a inland valley rather than as an arm of the ocean is, you really have to sit and sort of think about that for a while. It's interesting. But what's interesting to me is that the Salish Sea is unique in that the Pacific Ocean itself, as a basin, is probably over 1 billion years old. Well, it's over 1 billion years old for sure, and as an ocean basin, and yet our little arm of the Pacific Ocean is probably less than 2.5 million years old. That's vastly younger. In other words, the Salish Sea is a very recent addition to the Pacific Ocean. Sort of a cool addition. but a recent one. And that's sort of a fun thought to consider. So I'm going to end up then quickly by just looking at what's happened since the Ice Age. So, we've started off with plate tectonics, building the big picture, creating mountains. We've had the Ice Age, do a whole bunch of sculpting of that landscape. And really, ever since the ice retreated, rivers have ruled the day. And I'm going to focus on the Fraser because it's our biggest river. But really, what I say about the Fraser is true of all rivers. Anyways, it is a giant river. It's the third largest on the west coast of the Americas. That's both North and South America. Only the Columbia and the Yukon are bigger rivers, and it flows. Big river flows into a small sea, and that's sort of one of our realities. And so it is a huge influence on the Salish Sea. It is way more than a conveyor of water. It is a conveyor of mud, sand, and gravel. And these gravel islands in the Fraser River in the eastern Fraser Valley sort of are testimonial to that. This is sort of low flow. You can see the gravel is laid bare as the river levels are low. And so every river is essentially a conveyor of sediment. And that sediment gets moved to the ocean. Ultimately, it all lands in the Salish Sea. And the Fraser Delta is that dumping ground for the Fraser River. And I love this satellite image looking down on it because it so illustrates just all that muddy plume of river water flowing out into the Salish Sea and being sort of torqued around by tidal currents. We know the Fraser Delta as a giant floodplain, and which it is. It's a big flat top formed by floods of the Fraser River. The last big one in 1948. And since then, large dike systems have been built to sort of protect the land from flooding, but that will be a tough game to win over the long haul with sea level rise. And we are all going to be witness to sort of how we do on that. The other big aspect of the delta that we know and love dearly is the outer fringe, where sand and mud are deposited on the foreshore marshes and tidal flats of the delta. And this, of course, is the ecological jewel, I would say, of the entire Salish Sea, and a major ecological jewel of the whole west coast of North America. What's not often recognized is that there's a third dimension to the Fraser Delta and any delta, and it lies underwater and underground. And the Fraser Delta, as we know it, is just the flat top of a very thick pile of sand and silt that extends far. In fact, the toe of it extends all the way over to Galliano Island. So it's a vast sediment pile, only a portion of which shows its surface. And the Fraser has been doggedly building westwards ever since the Ice Age. And so on the left side of this diagram, we're looking at 10,000 years ago when the Fraser Delta was at about the point of New Westminster. And for reference, this is the future site of Steveston, and that's Point Roberts Island. And then by 5,000 years, that would be about the approximate position of the delta front. And today it is here. And so it is an ongoing, expanding story for the delta. And ultimately, the Fraser Delta and the other rivers of the Salish Sea will fill in the Salish Sea, given time. And I haven't sort of attempted the calculations, but it's probably in the millions of years to accomplish that. But that is what will happen. And in a sense, will undo the work of the glaciers. And here's sort of an interesting last thought. Before the Ice Age, North America was a river-dominated landscape, and the Salish Sea didn't exist, basically because rivers had filled everything in. Along come the glaciers during the Ice Age and scour out all these holes, including the Salish Sea. Um, and then as soon as the ice retreats, the rivers get back to their work. And that's what they're doing right now, filling back in the hole, the big hole of the Salish Sea that the ice carved. So anyways, that's the thought that I'll leave you with.
I would like to introduce the second speaker here for our first night, introducing the Salish Sea, March the 31st. We are going to be hearing from Chandler Colahan, who is the education coordinator at Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Bayview, Washington. She has been an environmental and marine educator for more than 25 years. And Chandler has a BA in Ocean Science Education and Creative Expression from Western Washington University, Fairhaven College. She's also spent many years researching plankton and jellyfish at the Shannon Point Marine Center and loves exploring the Salish Sea when in her free time. So very much welcome to you, and I'll turn it over for your talk to begin.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Anne. I appreciate it. Let me get my slides going here. All right, so welcome everybody. Again, my name is Chandler Colahan, and like Anne said, I am the Director of Education at the Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Bayview, Washington. And if you haven't ever been there, we are located kind of at the gateway to the San Juans. We like to say in the heart of the Salish Sea, just south of Bellingham. And it really is a spectacular place. We have the second largest continual eelgrass meadow in the United States in our bay, with nearly 9,000 acres that we are privileged to manage. And it acts like a living laboratory from people, for people, scientists from all over the world to come and study our bay. And so we're really in love with mudflats as well. Whoever put that as their favorite geological feature, I'm right there with you. It's great. But I wasn't always at Padilla Bay. I actually grew up in the state of Texas and was one of 6 kids. I had 4 older sisters. And when I was about 13 years old, my mom took me to visit my sister down in Corpus Christi, Texas. There are these beautiful brown sand beaches with brown waves, and it's hot, very hot in Texas in July. And I decided I was going to get my feet and legs wet and went out and was talking to a gentleman from Wisconsin, was standing in about knee-deep water, when all of a sudden I got this really strange sensation on my legs. And I looked down and I had about 20 feet of tentacles from a Portuguese man-o-war wrapped around both legs. And I didn't know what it was, but you've never seen anybody exit the ocean as fast as I did that day. And I just did not even understand what had happened to me. I knew that I was not feeling well. I felt sick for about 3 days. And I was very angry at this thing for stinging me. I didn't know anything about it. But the more I learned about it, the more fascinated I became. And that was kind of always my passion. But it didn't really make sense from a girl from North Central Texas to study the ocean. So I actually went to school for business. And years later, was not satisfied, moved to Washington State, and through a really fortunate series of events, ran into a jellyfish ecologist who worked at Western Washington University's Shannon Point Marine Center. And she loved my enthusiasm, and she took me under her wing. And that's how I started learning about plankton. And so I worked with her for about 7 years before I was an educator at Padilla Bay. So why plankton? Well, plankton is fascinating. The word plankton comes from the Greek word planktos, which means wanderer or drifter. So what we're talking about are organisms that are really at the mercy of tides and currents. That means they can't really move in a purposeful way on their own. They may be able to move up and down in a water column, but really they're going to be at the tide's mercy. Now, the term plankton is an unusual term in biology in that it groups things according to their locomotion rather than their genetic kinships. And we have a lot of plankton here in the Salish Sea, so much so that at times it can actually look soupy like this. Plankton are often microscopic, and when I'm talking microscopic, I'm talking teeny tiny measurements. We say microns. And just to give you an idea of how many microns would fit across the face of a penny, over 19,000. So we're talking really, really tiny things, no more than the width of a hair. That presents some special problems when you're studying these little microorganisms, and so scientists have come up with these really amazing tools for collecting plankton. This is what a typical plankton net looks like. It's got an opening on one end that connects to line that you can drag it behind a boat, you can put another line on it and drag it by hand. The mesh has teeny tiny holes that are actually smaller than whatever type of plankton you're wanting to collect. And then the bottom part is called the cod end. The black thing that you see above the bottle is kind of a weight, and then the collection container is at the bottom. This is a picture of our researchers at Padilla Bay doing a plankton tow. And it's interesting because often researchers will do tows off boats in a vertical fashion, but our bay is so shallow, often no more than about 10 feet deep in deepest places, they actually have to do it a horizontal tow to get plankton. Now, why should we even care about plankton? Why do we care about plankton in the Salish Sea? Well, there's some really great reasons. Here's kind of what the typical food web in the Salish Sea looks like. And plankton kind of drives that whole system. It's a very important energy source for a lot of organisms, and it's important as nutrient transports for a lot of organisms. Now, if you were to go and just dip a typical liter of seawater out of the Salish Sea, these are the amounts of different organisms that you could expect to see. Probably wouldn't get a fish. You get a few zooplankton or the animal type plankton. Then we get into the phytoplankton. And as the organisms get smaller and smaller, you're more likely to find more of them like cyanobacteria, prokaryotes, and viruses. I love this picture. This was a picture taken of a basking shark off of San Juan Island here in Washington State in 2015. And many people don't know that these are creatures that are native to the Salish Sea region. And as big and as scary as they look, they feed exclusively on teeny tiny plankton. And that's because we have a lot of plankton in our region. Like I said, plankton are also really important as nutrients for the deeper parts of the Salish Sea. When the plankton are no longer able to live at the surface, they get pushed down, and you may have heard of the term marine snow. Those nutrients get transported to places that might not otherwise have nutrients for things. Plankton is a very important provider of oxygen in the Salish Sea, and actually in oceans worldwide, it's very important. Scientists estimate that between 50 and 80% of all the oxygen on the planet comes from the ocean, and phytoplankton is a big part of that. Here in the Salish Sea, there is a lot of primary production from plankton. I love this picture. This is a nice sunny day at Padilla Bay in the spring or summer when it's nice and warm and there's a lot of sun. The phytoplankton will reproduce so quickly that the plants really can't keep up and will release these sugars that when the tides whip them up, turn to sea foam. Again, they are important transporters of nutrients, but also energy. Plankton are a big contributor to fossil fuels, and that just is that plankton layer that sinks down into the ocean and over lots of time and pressure becomes that rich mud layer that also can lead to fossil fuels for human use. Plankton can be very important ecological and paleoecological indicators. These are teeny tiny phytoplankton that were discovered about 10 years ago in Australia as fossils. And it turns out that they were 3.4 billion years old, much older than previously thought possible. One of the things that I had the fortune, one of the projects I had the fortune to work on when I was at Shannon Point was looking at jellyfish, specifically moon jellies in the Salish Sea area, as bioindicators of climate change. With changing conditions in the climate and in the environment, there are certain things that could benefit jellyfish populations. And so we studied those for a number of years. One of the things that we would do is when we noticed these big blooms or aggregations of moon jellies, we would go and do an aerial survey. You can actually see these blooms from the air, and we would fly out of the Bellingham International Airport in a very small Cessna plane, and we would fly over to, our study took place in East Sound off of Orcas Island in the San Juan Islands. We would fly at a altitude of 1,500 feet, and we could see these giant blooms of jellyfish. Sometimes they would be more than 3 miles long and just very, very densely packed with thousands and thousands of jellyfish. And when this happened, we knew that that could be a problem because jellyfish in those great numbers can outcompete other animals like juvenile salmon for food. And what we were finding at the time was that these jellyfish populations that were really only supposed to be living for about a year were overwintering in these great conditions and living twice as long as their normal life expectancy. And so there are pretty big implications with that when populations of, large populations of animals outlive their expectancy with regards to resources. Plankton can be very important contributors of biotoxins in the Salish Sea. If you've ever been around and seen these signs to not eat bivalves like clams and oysters, for example, a lot of those toxins come from phytoplankton that blooms in the Salish Sea different times of the year. Here's one called Pseudonychia. This one is responsible for what we call amnesic shellfish poisoning. It can cause mental problems for people who consume it. This is called dinophysis. It's a type of dinoflagellate phytoplankton that causes diuretic shellfish poisoning. Can be very severe and actually lead to death for some people. And then paralytic shellfish poisoning, commonly known as red tide, is caused by a number of different types of phytoplankton. Oftentimes when it happens, you see these patches in the water that almost look like tomato soup. I put this picture in with the dog as a reminder that if you see these conditions in the water, please don't let your pets or your children swim in these waters, because if they ingest it, they can make them sick and die too. Almost every summer, you hear reports of dogs dying in the Salish Sea from ingesting water that had red tide in it. Here's an example of a red tide event that happened just north of Padilla Bay in June of 2018. This is off Salish Island. You see Salish Island on the right-hand side there. And this lasted for several weeks. before it finally dispersed. But you can see it's large enough that it's clearly visible from the air. Now, the reason sometimes that these happen can be influenced by human activities like agriculture. With agriculture runoff, you're putting fertilizer on crops, and just like plants on land, plants and phytoplankton in the Salish Sea respond to that and will start growing and blooming faster than the predators can keep up. They can't eat it fast enough. And so these big blooms will happen and can cause problems, especially when those big blooms occur and they start to die off. When things start to die, bacteria starts to eat them and they consume the oxygen and creates what we call dead zones. It can be very damaging to populations of fish and other marine organisms. Cows in the freshwater system are never a good idea. One adult cow can poop about 120 pounds a day. And if that poop gets into the water and it flows from the creek down to the river, down to the estuary, where the clams and oysters and mussels are growing, and then we decide to go harvest some and make a delicious bowl of clam chowder, those bacteria are still in those shellfish and can make us very, very sick. So, of course, regulations are in place so that we manage those livestock populations and keep them out of the waterways. I'm not just blaming agriculture, though. All the migratory birds are also contributing to fecal coliform and other types of bacteria that can be considered fertilizer. In Padilla Bay, we are on the Pacific Flyway, and we see millions of birds on our bay every single year. They kind of stop in at the estuary while they're migrating, and it's a little rest stop. They use the bathroom, they eat, they rest, and then fly on. And dogs. We all love our pets, for sure, but their poop can be a problem. And in Washington State, the counties around the Salish Sea produce on a daily basis more than 260,000 pounds of dog poop every single day. And if that is not managed properly, it goes into our water system. It is not organic like many people think. If you leave that dog poop out in the yard, it's going to dry out in the sun and turn white and just go away. It doesn't work that way. Those bacteria, the harmful bacteria, stay in that dog poop. You have to have a specialized high heat composter to break down bacteria and pet waste. So as pet owners, the best thing you can do is pick up poop, scoop it in a bag, tie that bag in a knot, throw it away, and wash your hands. That's the best thing you could do to help keep the Salish Sea healthy. Septic tanks are also a problem if they're faulty. If they fail, that bacteria can get into the water as well. And that has been a problem in Skagit County where the reserve is. So our county has put special emphasis on making sure that people's septic systems stay in good repair. And when they don't, like I said, it can create what they call hypoxic conditions or oxygen depleted conditions because all the bacteria are sucking up the oxygen in the water as they are breaking down the blooms of phytoplankton and will choke out the animals. And it's really, really bad. This sometimes happens down in places like the Hood Canal in southern part of the Salish Sea and can devastate whole populations of animals. So I'm going to start talking a little bit now about phytoplankton, and I really love this image. This is a satellite image of the Salish Sea, the southern part of the Salish Sea. And you can see off the coast of Vancouver Island and off the coast of Washington State, there's some like murky green colors. Those are blooms of phytoplankton. And when conditions are right, we have so much primary productivity with our phytoplankton that it can be seen from space via satellite. Pretty amazing. And there's a couple of reasons that we live in such a great area for all this productivity. Um, the coast of Washington is a little bit different than other places in that we have a very short continental slope. On the east coast of North America, the beaches will go for miles and miles, and the continental slope can go as far out as 400 miles. On Washington's coast, it's anywhere between 7 and 40 miles. And so you've got this very sudden change from deep water to surface water, and the water gets pushed up. And this is very cold, acidic, nutrient-rich water that hasn't seen the light of day for decades. And it gets pushed up, and the warmer surface water gets kind of pushed down, and you've got this mixing of nutrients. And so it's really great conditions for plankton productivity. Now, plankton have developed great adaptations to keep themselves from sinking. Because if you're a little teeny phytoplankton and you're photosynthesizing and you cannot swim and you're at the mercy of tides and currents, and you need sunlight energy to photosynthesize, you've got to have a plan. So many phytoplankton have developed these amazing body structures where they've elongated themselves to create more surface area on their bodies. They will chain together to kind of do a buddy system so that they float a little bit more. They will even have drops of oil within their shells to help them be more buoyant. Diatoms are one of the types of phytoplankton that we see in the Salish Sea, and under a microscope, they can be quite beautiful, almost like snowflakes. They have a calcareous shell that's kind of like glass, and then it's got each diatom has a photosynthetic cell within. In Padilla Bay, sometimes the eelgrass gets this brown fuzzy stuff growing all over it, and people often think, ew, is there sewage spilling? What's going on? Why does this look so gross? But if you take the brown fuzzy stuff and you look at it under a microscope, it's actually big long chains of these beautifully shaped diatoms. That's always fun for us to see up close. The other type of phytoplankton we commonly see are called dinoflagellates. And these are little single-celled photosynthesizing organisms that have an appendage called a flagella. It's like a little whip-like thing that kind of helps move them around a little bit, but it's not really for locomotion by any means. It can kind of help create a current. It just does its own kind of thing. And the dinoflagellates are the ones that are mainly responsible for those red tides. Like I said, this is a pretty drastic image of a red tide. And I would be interested to see, I don't know how long this one lasted, but I would imagine that that would be a pretty significant red tide event. Here in the Salish Sea, we also have another type of red tide that is not harmful to humans. And it's caused by an organism called Noctiluca, which has the unique ability to create bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is an organism's ability to create a non-thermal or cold light via a chemical process. And if you've ever been to the beach around here at night in the summer and you've kind of waved your hand through the water and you see little sparkles, that's the bioluminescence. I have to say the picture on the left is not what it typically looks like. That is a time extended photo, time lapse photo to get that nice glowing effect, but it can be quite beautiful. I love this little snip. These are Pacific white-sided dolphins taken from the bow of someone's boat in British Columbia. These dolphins were actually riding the bow wake one night when there was this beautiful bioluminescent event happening. So keep your eyes peeled at night when you're out on the water. And I'm going to do a quick mention of the coccolithophores. These are absolutely teeny tiny organisms. You can see the bar on the bottom is 2 microns. And remember, it's 19,000 microns will fit across the face of a penny. They're made up of these calcium carbonate plates that surround a photosynthetic cell in the middle. And their claim to fame, the most famous claim to fame, are the White Cliffs of Dover that occurred about 70 million years ago. This was the sea floor, and those coccolithophores just built up and built up. And once the sea receded and those cliffs were up, you can see these beautiful white chalky cliffs caused by these old coccolithophore shells. Then we have zooplankton. These are our animal type plankton. And when we talk about zooplankton, we break them up into 2 major categories. The first being holoplankton. Holoplankton are plankton that stay in the plankton their whole lives. That's how I remember it. And then we have meroplankton. And meroplankton are plankton that are animals that spend part of their life as plankton, but then might grow up to be an animal you would recognize on a beach. So I'm going to just go through really quickly all of the different types of plankton that we typically see here in the Salish Sea, starting with the arthropods. These are the jointed-legged animals, like barnacles. These are all different phases of barnacles. Here's another type of crustacean called a copepod on the left. For any SpongeBob SquarePants fans out there, this is the animal that the character Plankton was based on. The animal on the right is called a cladoceraen, another type of crustacean. We love our crustaceans. Here are 3 more. The top left image is an amphipod. The top right green critter is called an isopod, and the bottom critter is called a skeleton shrimp. It's a type of amphipod as well, a coprolid amphipod. And we have lots of different types of crabs in the Salish Sea. Some of our favorite, the top image is a porcelain crab. The image on the left is a little baby Dungeness crab. And then the picture on the bottom right is a hermit crab. Lots of different types of shrimp as well, and they all look like little shrimp when they are in the plankton. Then we have some of our worms. These are the segmented worms or annelids, and we have some of the most beautiful, beautiful worms in the world right here in the Salish Sea. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, because how can a worm be beautiful? But really, truly, they are, and the annelids are some of the most beautiful of the beautiful worms. We also have nemertians or ribbon worms here in the Salish Sea. And they're often really cool to find because you might pick one up at a beach and it would be about 3 inches long, and you take it back to the lab and it gets good and relaxed, and it might stretch out to be 2 or 3 feet long. Another organism we often find in our plankton are called chaetognaths or arrow worms. We also have organisms called chordates. These are often gelatinous animals like salps, and they have what we call a notochord, or it's like a very primitive spinal cord. We have an animal called a larvacean here in our plankton, and I really love the larvaceans. They can do this amazing thing to gather food. The bottom right picture is this beautiful mucus net that larvaceans can make, and then they beat their tails to create a current so that little particles of detritus, or good dead rotten stuff, will stick to that mucus net, and then they go in and pick out what they need for nutrients, and then that net eventually, when it gets discarded, will sink down and transport more nutrients to the deeper parts of the Salish Sea. Now I'm going to take a minute here with the cnidarians because, again, based on my jellyfish experience and my research experience, I have a real soft spot for these creatures. These are all the different creatures that have stinging cells. So that includes not only jellyfish, but the sea anemones and corals. We have beautiful anemones around the Salish Sea. The Christmas tree anemone on the left and the brooding anemone on the right. You can see their little teeny babies attached to the mother's side there. We have these beautiful creatures, benthic creatures, or creatures that like to kind of stay at the bottom, called sea pens. They also have stinging cells in their feather-like appendages. And we do have some soft corals in the Salish Sea that are also part of the cnidarian group. And then, of course, our beloved jellyfish. This is not a real picture. I just put this in for fun. But this is the largest type of jellyfish in the Salish Sea, the lion's mane jelly. That can get to be, I've heard rumors, 6 feet across the top of the thing. The biggest one I've ever seen has been about 4 feet, and that was big enough. One of the cool things about these animals is they have a dual life cycle. They have a sexual reproductive phase and an asexual reproductive phase. And this is called alternation of generations. Alternation of generations. And what that means is we don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. This is the life cycle of a moon jelly. And you can see at the top there are 2 sexually mature jellyfish. The male on the left that's releasing sperm, and the female on the right that is taking that sperm up into her body. Those sperm are fertilized internally in the female and released as a little ciliated, kind of ciliated egg called a planula. That planula will go and find a hard substrate to settle on, and we call that a polyp. Those polyps grow tentacles with stinging cells so that it can catch prey. And once it's consumed enough food and has enough energy, it starts the process of strobilation, which is actually the process of it going through cold fission and dividing itself into these stacks. It looks like little stacks of plates, well, little stacks of snowflakes, really. And when each snowflake is ready, it will peel off from the top of the stack, and that little baby jellyfish, or Ephira, will grow to be a sexually mature male or female moon jelly. And the process starts over again. And the crazy thing about these jellyfish is that those polyps, that polyp phase, the strobilation phase, it can just keep going forever. So they are very, very prolific at reproduction. And they're often referred to as the cockroaches of the sea. When all kind of conditions change, they're still going to be hanging on. Here's what it looks like in real life, with the mature jellyfish being in the bottom right. That baby jellyfish, or Ephira, is the bottom left. The actual process of strobilation is that top left. And then the little ciliated planula is the top right photograph. I'm going to touch on these two because I love talking about these 2 jellyfish. They're kind of the rock stars of the Salish Sea. The picture on the left is commonly referred to as the red-eyed jellyfish. It was the first jellyfish ever studied in the Salish Sea. The right picture is the crystal or water jelly, very common, and it's the only jellyfish to have ever been responsible for a scientist winning the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. That was in 2005. A researcher from Friday Harbor Labs, University of Washington's laboratory in Friday Harbor, worked on this project back in the late 1950s, early 60s, and was able to recreate the green fluorescent protein that the jellyfish has, and it has had major positive implications for neuroscience research in expressing genes and being able to study the deeper parts of the brain. Here's some other types of animals that are kind of grouped in with the jellyfish. They're called siphonophores, and these are jellyfish that are colonial animals. So actually, the Portuguese man of war is in this group as well, siphonophores. And you can see the kind of the bell-like structures on the jellyfish are what helps with its movement. And then the thing that streams down, the white thing, each one of those bright white things is kind of a stomach of sorts, and then each stomach has a kind of a tentacle with stinging cells that it puts out like a fishing line, and as it catches food, we'll move it back to the stomach, and they all work collaboratively to ensure success. Another type of gelatinous animal, ctenophores or comb jellies, are very common here in the Salish Sea. They're not true jellies because they have sticky cells called coloblasts rather than stinging cells. But they are quite beautiful as well if you see them. Another type of plankton are our echinoderms, the spiny skinned animals like sea stars, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, sand dollars. They're all related to one another. We love our cephalopods. We call them our charismatic megafauna. We've got the giant Pacific octopus around here, and the beautiful little ruby octopus and squid. We love them. Gastropods, or the stomach-footed animals. These include snails, the nudibranchs, and these beautiful animals called sea butterflies on the left, and then bubble shell snails on the bottom right. Mollusks also start their lives as plankton, and they grow up to be bivalves like clams, oysters, scallops, the wonderful gooey duck, and mussels, of course. Plankton are under threat in the Salish Sea, just like everything else, with extra or rampant carbon dioxide entering our atmosphere. It affects our waterways and our oceans and creates a number of problems, including warming temperatures. And when warming temperatures occur in the ocean, it slows circulation down for currents. And in places like the Indian Ocean, warming ocean currents have slowed mixing of nutrients, and plankton populations have decreased by about 40% in the Indian Ocean in places since 1950. Not only that, but when you mix atmospheric CO2 with water, it creates a very weak acid called carbonic acid. And that's a problem for animals like snails and oysters that need calcium carbonate building blocks to build their shells properly. And what scientists know is that this most affects baby animals that are shell building animals, specifically in the first 48 hours of their lives. Because when seawater is more acidic, that means there are less of these calcium carbonate building blocks for them to be able to grab out of the water to build their shells, and they're brittle and they don't form properly, and the animals will die. This has happened in Washington State, specifically in our area near Padilla Bay, to the point where our commercial shell fisheries in the area have had to send their oyster seed out. They've had to outsource the baby growing process to places like Hawaii or Oregon, who are not experiencing this as dramatically as we are at the moment. And again, part of that, part of the reason it is so prevalent where we are is because we get that upwelling, that deep acidic water naturally occurring when that water hits the continental shelf and comes into the Salish Sea, creating problems. Another big problem for plankton are microplastics. Sadly, I can't remember a time in the past, in the recent past, where I have not had at least a little bit of microplastic in any of my plankton samples. And by microplastic, I mean a plastic particle that's smaller than 5 millimeters. This can include a lot of fibers from clothes like polar fleece jackets. We're all Northwesterners here. We love our polar fleece, but those little fibers get out into our waterways and can create a problem. So yeah, like I said, the fibers can be a real bear. There are things that companies are starting to do now. I believe Patagonia has special bags that you can buy to wash your fleece clothes in that collects the particles, and then you can just send the bag back to Patagonia for them to dispose of the fibers, but I'm not exactly sure what that process looks like. There haven't been any perfect answers yet. There are special filters you can buy for your washing machine, but they're also very, very expensive. So it's a good problem for young people who are thinking of entering the field of engineering. That's a problem that we definitely need to get solved. And of course, there are wonderful people in the Salish Sea working on these problems. Here in our area, in San Juan County, the Plastic Free Salish Sea campaign has been going on for a number of years. In Skagit County, groups have been working on the Beyond the Bend recycling guide to give people the most up-to-date information on what can be recycled and what can't. And then doing outreach work at our local co-ops and grocery stores of why we should be using recyclable bags. So there is good work going on as well. And with that, I will give you all my contact information.
Thank you so much for all of this, Chandler. Absolutely fascinating. I love watching the live little things going back and forth, and really appreciate your time and energy to join us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you both to Bob and Chandler for being here tonight and kicking off the Wonders of the Salish Sea series this year. We really appreciate you both taking the time to share your knowledge with us, and we're super happy to see you both tonight.